That is to say, behavior is not always consistent with relevant beliefs and attitudes. Here we are making the point that most people feel that their beliefs and attitudes should be consistent with their behavior and, therefore, are motivated to justify their behavior when it is inconsistent with a pre-existing attitude. Let me cite an example that is, alas, all too familiar to many people. Suppose a person smokes cigarettes and then reads a report of the medical evidence linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer and other diseases. The smoker experiences dissonance. The cognition "I smoke cigarettes" is dissonant with the cognition cigarette smoking produces cancer. Clearly, the most efficient way for this person to reduce dissonance in such a situation is to give up smoking. The cognition cigarette smoking produces cancer is consonant with the cognition "I do not smoke," but, for most people, it is not easy to give up smoking. Imagine Sally, a young woman who tried to stop smoking but failed. What will she do to reduce dissonance? In all probability, she will try to work on the other cognition: cigarette smoking produces cancer. Sally might attempt to make light of evidence linking cigarette smoking to cancer. For example, she might try to convince herself that the experimental evidence is inconclusive. In addition, she might seek out intelligent people who smoke and, by so doing, convince herself that if Debbie, Nicole, and Larry smoke, it can't be all that dangerous. Sally might switch to a filter-tipped brand and delude herself into believing that the filter traps the cancer-producing materials. Finally, she might add cognitions that are consonant with smoking in an attempt to make the behavior less absurd in spite of its danger. Thus, Sally might enhance the value placed on smoking, that is, she might come to believe smoking is an important and highly enjoyable activity that is essential for relaxation. I may lead a shorter life, but it will be a more enjoyable one. Similarly, she might try to make a virtue out of smoking by developing a romantic, devil-may-care self-image, flouting danger by smoking cigarettes. All such behavior reduces dissonance by reducing the absurdity of the notion of going out of one's way to contract cancer. Sally has justified her behavior by cognitively minimizing the danger or by exaggerating the importance of the action. In effect, she has succeeded either in constructing a new attitude or in changing an existing attitude. Indeed, shortly after the publicity surrounding the original Surgeon General's report in 1964, a survey was conducted to assess people's reactions to the new evidence that smoking helps cause cancer. Non-smokers overwhelmingly believed the health report, only 10% of those queried saying that the link between smoking and cancer had not been proven to exist. These respondents had no motivation to disbelieve the report. The smokers faced a more difficult quandary. Self-justification 181. Smoking is a difficult habit to break. Only 9% of the smokers had been able to quit. To justify continuing the activity, smokers tended to debunk the report. They were more likely to deny the evidence. 40% of the heavy smokers said a link had not been proven to exist. They were also more apt to employ rationalizations. More than twice as many smokers as non-smokers agreed that there are many hazards in life and that both smokers and non-smokers get cancer. Smokers who are painfully aware of the health hazards associated with smoking may reduce dissonance in yet another way, by minimizing the extent of their habit. One study found that of 155 smokers who smoked between 1 and 2 packs of cigarettes a day, 60% considered themselves moderate smokers. The remaining 40% considered themselves heavy smokers. How can we explain these different self-perceptions? Not surprisingly, those who labeled themselves as moderates were more aware of the pathological long-term effects of smoking than were those who labeled themselves as heavy smokers. That is, these particular smokers apparently reduced dissonance by convincing themselves that smoking 1 or 2 packs a day isn't really all that much. Moderate and heavy are, after all, subjective terms. Imagine a teenage girl who has not yet begun to smoke. After reading the Surgeon General's report, is she apt to believe it? Like most of the non-smokers in the survey, she should. The evidence is objectively sound, the source is expert and trustworthy, and there is no reason not to believe the report. And this is the crux of the matter. Earlier in this book, I made the point that people strive to be right, and that values and beliefs become internalized when they appear to be correct. It is this striving to be right that motivates people to pay close attention to what other people are doing and to heed the advice of expert, trustworthy communicators. This is extremely rational behavior. There are forces, however, that can work against this rational behavior. The theory of cognitive dissonance does not picture people as rational beings, rather, it pictures them as rationalizing beings. According to the underlying assumptions of the theory, we humans are motivated not so much to be right as to believe we are right. Sometimes, our motivation to be right and our motivation to believe we are right work in the same direction. This is what has happened. 182 The social animal, with the young woman who doesn't smoke and therefore finds it easy to accept the notion that smoking causes lung cancer. This would also be true for a smoker who encounters the evidence linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer and then succeeds in giving up cigarettes. Occasionally, however, the need to reduce dissonance leads to behavior that is maladaptive and therefore irrational. For example, many people have tried to quit smoking and failed. What do these people do? It would be erroneous to assume that they simply swallow hard and prepare to die. They don't. Instead, they try to reduce their dissonance in a different way, namely, by convincing themselves that smoking isn't as bad as they thought. Thus, Rick Gibbons and his colleagues recently found that heavy smokers who attended a smoking cessation clinic, quit smoking for a while and then relapsed into heavy smoking again, subsequently succeeded in lowering their perception of the dangers of smoking. Why might this change of heart occur? If a person makes a serious commitment to a course of action, such as quitting smoking, and then fails to keep that commitment, his or her self-concept as a strong, self-controlled individual is threatened. This, of course, arouses dissonance. One way to reduce this dissonance and regain a healthy sense of self, if not a healthy set of lungs, is to trivialize the commitment by perceiving smoking as less dangerous. A more general study that tracked the progress of 135 students who made New Year's resolutions supports this observation. Individuals who broke their resolutions, such as to quit smoking, lose weight, or exercise more, initially felt bad about themselves for failing but, after a short time, succeeded in downplaying the importance of the resolution. Ironically, making light of a commitment they failed to keep serves to restore their self-esteem, but it also makes self-defeat a near certainty in the future. In the short run, they are able to feel better about themselves. In the long run, however, they have drastically reduced the chances that they'll ever succeed in achieving their goals. Is this the only way to reduce the dissonance associated with failing to achieve a goal? No. An alternative response, and perhaps a less maladaptive one, would be to lower one's expectations for success. For example, a person who has been unable to give up smoking completely, but who has cut down on the number of cigarettes smoked daily, could interpret this outcome as a partial success rather than as self-justification. 183, a complete failure. This course of action would soften the blow to his or her self-esteem for having failed while still holding out the possibility of achieving success in future efforts to quit smoking altogether. Let's stay with the topic of cigarette smoking for a moment and consider an extreme example. Suppose you are one of the top executives of a major cigarette company, and therefore in a situation of maximum commitment to the idea of cigarette smoking. Your job consists of producing, advertising, and selling cigarettes to millions of people. If it is true that cigarette smoking causes cancer, then, in a sense, you are partially responsible for the illness and death of a great many people. This would produce a painful degree of dissonance. Your cognition I am a decent, kind human being would be dissonant with your cognition I am contributing to the early death of thousands of people. To reduce this dissonance, you must try to convince yourself that cigarette smoking is not harmful. This would involve a refutation of the mountain of evidence suggesting a causal link between cigarettes and cancer. Moreover, to convince yourself further that you are a good, moral person, you might go so far as to demonstrate how much you disbelieve the evidence by smoking a great deal yourself. If your need is great enough, You might even succeed in convincing yourself that cigarettes are good for people. Thus, to see yourself as wise, good, and right, you take action that is stupid and detrimental to your health. This analysis is so fantastic that it's almost beyond belief, almost. In 1994, Congress conducted hearings on the dangers of smoking. At these hearings, the top executives of most of the major tobacco companies admitted they were smokers and actually argued that cigarettes are no more harmful or addictive than playing video games or eating Twinkies. In a subsequent hearing in 1997, James J. Morgan, president and chief executive officer of the leading U.S. cigarette maker, said that cigarettes are not pharmacologically addictive. "Look, I like gummy bears and I eat gummy bears. And I don't like it when I don't eat gummy bears," Morgan said. "But I'm certainly not addicted to them." This kind of public denial is nothing new, of course. 40 years ago, the following news item was released by the Washington Post's news service. Jack Landry pulls what must be his 30th Marlboro of the day out of one of the 2 packs on his desk, lights a match to it and, 184 The social animal, tells how he doesn't believe all those reports about smoking and cancer and emphysema. He has just begun to market yet another cigarette for Philip Morris USA and is brimming over with satisfaction over its prospects. But how does he square with his conscience the spending of $10 million in these United States over the next year to lure people into smoking his new brand? "It's not a matter of that," says Landry, Philip Morris's vice president for marketing. "Nearly half the adults in this country smoke. It's a basic commodity for them. I'm serving a need." There are studies by pretty eminent medical and scientific authorities, one on a theory of stress, on how a heck of a lot of people, if they didn't have cigarette smoking to relieve stress, would be one hell of a lot worse off, and there are plenty of valid studies that indicate cigarette smoking and all those diseases are not related. His satisfaction, says Landry, comes from being very good at his job in a very competitive business, and he will point out that Philip Morris and its big-selling Marlboro has just passed American Tobacco as the #2 cigarette seller in America. Why a new cigarette now? Because it is there to be sold, says Landry, and therein lies the inspiration of the marketing of a new American cigarette, which Landry confidently predicts will have a 1% share of the American market within 12 months. That 1% will equal about 5 billion cigarettes and a healthy profit for Philip Morris USA. It is possible that James Morgan and Jack Landry are simply lying, but it may be a bit more complicated than that. My guess is that, over the years, they may have succeeded in deceiving themselves. 10. If I am deeply committed to an attitude or an idea, I will have a strong tendency to doubt the veracity of any opposing point of view. To mention one chilling example of this process, consider the Heilbop suicides. In 1997, 39 members of Heaven's Gate, an obscure religious cult, were found dead at a luxury estate in Rancho Santa Fe, California, participants in a mass suicide. Several weeks earlier, a few members of the cult had walked into a specialty store and purchased an expensive high-powered telescope so that they might get a clearer view of the Heilbop comet and the spaceship they fervently believed was traveling behind it. Their belief was that, when the comet, self-justification 185, got close to Earth, it was time to rid themselves of their earthly containers by killing themselves so that their essence could be picked up by the spaceship. A few days after buying the telescope, they brought it back to the store and politely asked for a refund. When the manager asked why, they complained that the telescope was defective. "We found the comet all right, but we can't find the spaceship that's following it." Needless to say, there was no spaceship. But if you are so convinced of the existence of a spaceship that you're ready to die for a ride on it, and yet your telescope doesn't reveal it, then, clearly, there must be something wrong with your telescope. Juicy anecdotes are suggestive. But they do not constitute scientific evidence and, therefore, are not convincing in themselves. Again, taking the cigarette example, it is always possible that Mr. Morgan and Mr. Landry know that cigarettes are harmful and are simply being cynical. Likewise, It is possible that Landry always believed cigarettes were good for people even before he began to peddle them. Obviously, if either of these possibilities were true, his excitement about the benefits of cigarette smoking could hardly be attributed to dissonance. Much more convincing would be a demonstration of a clear case of attitudinal distortion in a unique event. Such a demonstration was provided back in the 1950s by a football game in the Ivy League, an important game between Princeton and Dartmouth. The contest was billed as a grudge match, and this soon became evident on the field. The game is remembered as the roughest and dirtiest in the history of either school. Princeton's star player was an All-American running back named Dick Casimir. As the game progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Dartmouth players were out to get him. Whenever he carried the ball, he was gang tackled, piled on, and mauled. He was finally forced to leave the game with a broken nose. Meanwhile, the Princeton team was not exactly inactive. Soon after Casimir's injury, a Dartmouth player was carried off the field with a broken leg. Several fistfights broke out on the field in the course of the game, and many injuries were suffered on both sides. Sometime after the game, a couple of psychologists, Albert Haystorff of Dartmouth and Hadley Cantrill of Princeton 11, visited both campuses and showed films of the game to a number of Stu. 186. The social animal. Dents on each campus. The students were instructed to be completely objective and, while watching the film, to take notes of each infraction of the rules, how it started, and who was responsible. As you might imagine, there was a huge difference in the way this game was viewed by the students at each university. There was a strong tendency for the students to see their own fellow students as victims of illegal infractions rather than as perpetrators of such acts of aggression. Moreover, this was no minor distortion. It was found that Princeton students saw fully twice as many violations on the part of the Dartmouth players as the Dartmouth students saw. Again, people are not passive receptacles for the deposition of information. The manner in which they view and interpret information depends on how deeply they are committed to a particular belief or course of action. Individuals will distort the objective world to reduce their dissonance. The manner in which they will distort and the intensity of their distortion are highly predictable. A few years later, Lenny Bruce, a perceptive comedian and social commentator, had the following insight into the 1960 presidential election campaign between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. "I would be with a bunch of Kennedy fans watching the debate and their comment would be, 'He's really slaughtering Nixon.' Then we would all go to another apartment, and the Nixon fans would say, 'How do you like the shellacking he gave Kennedy?' And then I realized that each group loved their candidate so that a guy would have to be this blatant. He would have to look into the camera and say, 'I am a thief, a crook. Do you hear me? I am the worst choice you could ever make for the presidency.' And even then his following would say, 'Now there's an honest man for you.' It takes a big guy to admit that. There's the kind of guy we need for president." 12. People don't like to see or hear things that conflict with their deeply held beliefs or wishes. An ancient response to such bad news was literally to kill the messenger. A modern-day figurative version of killing the messenger is to blame the media for the presentation of material that produces the pain of dissonance. For example, when Ronald Reagan was running for president in 1980, Time published, Self-Justification 187. An analysis of his campaign. Subsequent angry letters to the editor vividly illustrated the widely divergent responses of his supporters, on the one hand, and his detractors, on the other. Consider the following two letters: 13. Lawrence Barrett's pre-election piece on candidate Ronald Reagan was a slick hatchet job, and you know it. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves for printing it disguised as an objective look at the man. Your story on the real Ronald Reagan did it. Why didn't you just editorially endorse him? Barrett glosses over Reagan's fatal flaws so handily that the real Ronald Reagan came across as the answer to all our problems. The diversity of perception reflected in these letters is not unique to the 1980 campaign. It happened with Clinton supporters and detractors. It happened with G.W. Bush supporters and detractors, and it happened with Obama supporters and detractors. Indeed, it happens every 4 years. During the next presidential election, Check out the letters to the editor of your favorite news magazine following a piece on one of the leading candidates. You will find a similar array of divergent perceptions, dissonance reduction and rational behavior. I have referred to dissonance-reducing behavior as irrational. By this I mean it is often maladaptive in that it can prevent people from learning important facts or from finding real solutions to their problems. On the other hand, it does serve a purpose. Dissonance-reducing behavior is ego-defensive behavior. By reducing dissonance, we maintain a positive image of ourselves, an image that depicts us as good, or smart, or worthwhile. Again, although this ego-defensive behavior can be considered useful, it can have disastrous consequences. In the laboratory, the irrationality of dissonance-reducing behavior has been amply demonstrated by Edward Jones and Rika Kohler. 14 These investigators selected individuals who were deeply 188 the social animal, committed to a position on the issue of racial segregation. Some of the participants were in favor of segregation, and others were opposed to it. These individuals were allowed to read a series of arguments on both sides of the issue. Some of these arguments were extremely sensible and plausible, and others were so implausible that they bordered on the ridiculous. Jones and Kohler were interested in determining which of the arguments people would remember best. If people were purely rational, we would expect them to remember the plausible arguments best and the implausible arguments least. Why in the world would people want to keep implausible arguments in their heads? Accordingly, the rational person would rehearse and remember all the arguments that made sense and would slough off all the ridiculous arguments. What does the theory of cognitive dissonance predict? It is comforting to have all the wise people on your side and all the fools on the other side. A silly argument in favor of one's own position arouses dissonance because it raises doubts about the wisdom of that position or the intelligence of the people who agree with it. Likewise, a plausible argument on the other side of the issue also arouses dissonance because it raises the possibility that the other side is right. Because these arguments arouse dissonance, one tries not to think about them, that is, one might not learn them very well, or one might simply forget about them. This is exactly what Jones and Kohler found. Their participants did not remember in a rational functional manner. They tended to remember the plausible arguments agreeing with their own position and the implausible arguments agreeing with the opposing position. In a conceptually similar experiment, Charles Lord, Lee Ross, and Mark Lepper 15 showed that we do not process information in an unbiased manner. Rather, we distort it in a way that fits our preconceived notions. These investigators selected several Stanford University students who opposed capital punishment and several who favored it. They showed the students 2 research articles that discussed whether the death penalty tends to deter violent crimes. One study confirmed and the other study disconfirmed the existing beliefs of the students. If these students were perfectly rational, they might conclude that the issue is a complex one, and accordingly, the 2 groups of students might move closer to each other in their beliefs. Self-justification 189, about capital punishment. On the other hand, dissonance theory predicts that they would distort the 2 articles, clasping the confirming article to their bosoms and hailing it as clearly supportive of their belief while finding methodological or conceptual flaws in the disconfirming article and refusing to be influenced by it. This is precisely what happened. Indeed, rather than coming closer in their beliefs after being exposed to this two-sided presentation, the 2 groups of students disagreed more sharply than they did beforehand. This process probably accounts for the fact that, on issues like politics and religion, people who are deeply committed will almost never come to see things our way, no matter how powerful and balanced our arguments are. Those of us who have worked extensively with the theory of cognitive dissonance do not deny that humans are capable of rational behavior. The theory merely suggests that a good deal of our behavior is not rational, although, from inside, it may seem very sensible indeed. If you ask the hypnotized young man why he wore a raincoat on a sunny day, he'll come up with an answer he feels is sensible. If you ask the vice president of Philip Morris why he smokes, he'll give you a reason that makes sense to him. He'll tell you how good it is for everyone's health. If you ask Jones and Kohler's participants why they remembered one particular set of arguments rather than others, they'll insist that the arguments they remembered were a fair and balanced sample of those they read. Similarly, the students in the experiment on capital punishment will insist that the evidence against their position is flawed. It is important to note that the world is not divided into rational people on the one side and dissonance reducers on the other. People are not all the same, and some people are able to tolerate dissonance better than others, but we are all capable of rational behavior and we are all capable of dissonance-reducing behavior, depending on the circumstances. Occasionally, the same person can manifest both behaviors in rapid succession. The rationality and irrationality of human behavior will be illustrated over and over again during the next several pages as we discuss some of the wide ramifications of our need for self-justification. These ramifications run virtually the entire gamut of human behavior, but for the sake of conserving time and space, I will sample only 190 the social animal, a few of these. Let us begin with the decision-making process. A process that shows humans at their most rational and their most irrational in quick succession. Dissonance as a consequence of making a decision. Suppose you are about to make a decision about the purchase of a new car, for example. This involves a significant amount of money, so it is, by definition, an important decision. After looking around, you are torn between getting a sports utility vehicle and purchasing a compact model. There are various advantages and disadvantages to each. The SUV would be convenient, you can haul things in it, sleep in it during long trips, and it has plenty of power, but it gets atrocious mileage and is not easy to park. The compact model is less roomy, and you are concerned about its safety, but it is less expensive to buy and operate. It is more fun to drive, and you've heard it has a pretty good repair record. My guess is that, before you make the decision, you will seek as much information as you can. Chances are you will go online and sample reviews of the various. You might even read Consumer Reports to find out what this expert, unbiased source has to say. Perhaps you'll confer with friends who own an SUV or a compact car. You'll probably visit the dealers to test drive the vehicles to see how each one feels. All of this pre-decision behavior is perfectly rational. Let us assume you make a decision, you buy the compact car. What happens next? Your behavior will begin to change. No longer will you seek objective information about all makes of cars. Chances are you may begin to spend more time talking with the owners of small cars. You will begin to talk about the number of miles to the gallon as though it were the most important thing in the world. My guess is that you will not be prone to spend much time thinking about the fact that you can't sleep in your compact. Similarly, your mind will skim lightly over the fact that driving your new car can be particularly hazardous in a collision and that the brakes are not very responsive, although your failure to attend to these shortcomings could conceivably cost you your life. Self-justification 191. How does this sort of thing come about? Following a decision, especially a difficult one, or one that involves a significant amount of time, effort, or money, people almost always experience dissonance. This is so because the chosen alternative is seldom entirely positive and the rejected alternatives are seldom entirely negative. In this example, your cognition that you bought a compact is dissonant with your cognition about any deficiencies the car may have. Similarly, all the positive aspects of the other cars that you considered buying but did not purchase are dissonant with your cognition that you did not buy one of them. A good way to reduce such dissonance is to seek out exclusively positive information about the car you chose and avoid negative information about it. One source of safe information is advertisements. It is a safe bet that an ad will not run down its own product. Accordingly, one might predict that a person who had recently purchased a new car will begin to read advertisements selectively, reading more ads about his or her car after the purchase than people who have not recently purchased the same model. Moreover, owners of new cars will tend to steer clear of ads for other makes of cars. This is exactly what Danuta Ehrlich and her colleagues 16 found in a well-known survey of advertising readership. In short, Ehrlich's data suggest that, after making decisions, People try to gain reassurance that their decisions were wise by seeking information that is certain to be reassuring. People do not always need help from Madison Avenue to gain reassurance. They can do a pretty good job of reassuring themselves. An experiment by Jack Brim 17 demonstrates how this can come about. Posing as a marketing researcher, Brim showed several women 8 different appliances and asked that they rate them in terms of how attractive each appliance was. As a reward, each woman was told she could have one of the appliances as a gift, and she was given a choice between 2 of the products she had rated as being equally attractive. After she chose one, it was wrapped up and given to her. Several minutes later, she was asked to rate the products again. It was found that after receiving the appliance of her choice, each woman rated the attractiveness of that appliance somewhat higher and decreased the rating of the appliance she had a chance to own but rejected. Again, making a detch. 192 The social animal, Scion produces dissonance. Cognitions about any negative aspects of the preferred object are dissonant with having chosen it, and cognitions about the positive aspects of the unchosen object are dissonant with not having chosen it. To reduce dissonance, people cognitively spread apart the alternatives. That is, after making their decision, the women in Brim's study emphasized the positive attributes of the appliance they decided to own while de-emphasizing its negative attributes. For the appliance they decided not to own, they emphasized its negative attributes and de-emphasized its positive attributes. The tendency to justify one's choices is not limited to consumer decisions. In fact, research has demonstrated that similar processes can even affect our romantic relationships and our willingness to consider becoming involved with alternative partners. In a study conducted by Dennis Johnson and Carol Rusbult, 18 college students were asked to evaluate the probable success of a new computer dating service on campus. Participants were shown pictures of individuals of the opposite sex, who they believed were applicants to the dating service. They were then asked to rate the attractiveness of these applicants, as well as how much they believed they would enjoy a potential date with him or her, a possibility that was presented in a realistic manner. The results of this study were remarkably similar to Brim's findings about appliances. The more heavily committed the students were to their current romantic partners, the more negative were their ratings of the attractiveness of alternative partners presented in the study. In a subsequent experiment, Jeffrey Simpson and his colleagues 19 also found that those in committed relationships saw opposite-sex persons as less physically and sexually attractive than did those who weren't in committed relationships. In addition, Simpson and his co-workers showed that this effect holds only for available others. When presented with individuals who were somewhat older or who were of the same sex, people in committed relationships did not derogate their attractiveness. In short, no threat, no dissonance, no derogation. In sum, whether we are talking about appliances or romantic partners, once a firm commitment has been made, people tend to focus on the positive aspects of their choices and to downplay the attractive qualities of the unchosen alternatives. Self-justification 193. The consequences of decisions. Some historical examples. Although some of the material discussed above is benign enough, it is impossible to overstate the potential dangers posed by our susceptibility to these tendencies. When I mentioned that ignoring potential danger to reduce dissonance could conceivably lead to a person's death, I meant that literally. Suppose a madman has taken over your country and has decided to eradicate all members of your religious group, but you don't know that for sure. What you do know is that your country is being occupied, that the leader of the occupation forces does not like your religious group, and that occasionally members of your faith are forced to move from their homes and are kept in detention camps. What do? You could try to flee from your country, you could try to pass as a member of a different religious group, or you could sit tight and hope for the best. Each of these options is extremely dangerous. It is difficult to escape or to pass and go undetected, and if you are caught trying to flee or disguising your identity, the penalty is immediate execution. On the other hand, deciding to sit tight could be a disastrous decision if it turns out that your religious group is being systematically annihilated. Let us suppose you decide not to take action. That is, you commit yourself to sit tight, turning your back on opportunities to try either to escape or to pass. Such an important decision naturally produces a great deal of dissonance.
To reduce dissonance, you convince yourself that you made a wise decision. That is, you convince yourself that, although people of your religious sect are made to move and are being treated unfairly, they are not being killed unless they break the law. This position is not difficult to maintain because there is no unambiguous evidence to the contrary. Suppose that, months later, a respected man from your town tells you that while hiding in the forest, he witnessed soldiers butchering all the men, women, and children who had recently been deported from the town. I would predict that you would try to dismiss this information as untrue, that you would attempt to convince yourself that the reporter was lying or hallucinating. If you had listened to the man who tried to warn you, you might have escaped. Instead, you and your family are slaughtered. 194. The social animal. Fantastic? Impossible? How could anyone not take the respected man seriously? The events described above are an accurate account of what happened in 1944 to the Jews in Sziget, Hungary. 20. The processes of cognitive distortion and selective exposure to information were important factors in the senseless escalation of the war in Vietnam. In a thought-provoking analysis of the Pentagon Papers, Ralph White shows how dissonance blinded our leaders to information incompatible with the decisions they had already made. As White put it, there was a tendency, when actions were out of line with ideas, for decision-makers to align their ideas with their actions. To take just one of many examples, the decision to continue to escalate the bombing of North Vietnam was made at the price of ignoring crucial evidence from the CIA and other sources that made it clear that bombing would not break the will of the North Vietnamese people but, quite the contrary, would only strengthen their resolve. It is instructive, for instance, to compare McNamara's highly factual evidence-oriented summary of the case against bombing in 1966 with the Joint Chiefs Memorandum that disputed his conclusion and called the bombing one of our two trump cards, while it apparently ignored all of the facts that showed the opposite. Yet it was the Joint Chiefs who prevailed. 2-1. More recently, President George W. Bush wanted to believe that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. That posed a threat to Americans. This led the president and his advisors to interpret the information in CIA reports as definitive proof of Iraq's WMDS, even though the reports were ambiguous and contradicted by other evidence. President Bush's interpretation provided the justification to launch a preemptive war. He was convinced that once our troops entered Iraq they would find these weapons. After the invasion of Iraq, when asked where are the WMDs, administration officials said that Iraq is a big country in which the WMDs are well hidden, but asserted that the weapons would be found. As the months dragged on and still no WMDs were found, the officials continued to assert that they would be uncovered. Why? Self-justification. 195. Because the administration officials were experiencing enormous dissonance. They had to believe they would find the WMDs. Finally, it was officially concluded that there were no such weapons, which suggests that, at the time of our invasion, Iraq posed no immediate threat to the United States. Now what? American soldiers and Iraqi civilians were dying every week, and hundreds of billions of dollars were being drained from the U.S. Treasury. How did President Bush and his staff reduce dissonance? By adding new cognitions to justify the war. Suddenly, we learned that the U.S. mission was to liberate the nation from a cruel dictator and bestow upon the Iraqi people the blessings of democratic institutions. To a neutral observer, that justification was inadequate. But, to President Bush and his advisors, who had been experiencing dissonance, the justification seemed reasonable. Several commentators have suggested that the Bush administration was dissembling. That is, that it was deliberately trying to